apologizing because you will have to use your headsets because the rest of this talk will be in English. I'd like to thank Marcelo for inviting us to talk at the conference, the other speakers we'd like to thank, and yourselves for staying and listening. That's very good. This is our talk, and my colleague here, if you stand up. This is Jay Vaughan, who is a clinical director at Family Futures, which we'll talk about, that organization in a minute. She's a drama therapist, a dyadic developmental psychotherapist, a theraplay practitioner, and somatic experience practitioner. And I am the director, co-director with Jay Vaughan of Family Futures, and I am a social worker by background and have a lifetime award for my work in the field of adoption. So far, this conference has covered the political aspects of violence against women, the legal aspects, the sociological aspects, the interpersonal aspects. Our talk, our presentation, will cover the psychological impact of violence against women on those children who live in the families where domestic violence is experienced by them. Because this isn't an academic forum, we haven't put references and papers at every point. I hope you will believe that what we are talking about is based on the most recent neuroscience research, neuroscientific theory, and our collective clinical experience at Family Futures. Family Futures is an adoption agency and also an integrated, multidisciplinary assessment and treatment service for traumatized children who have been removed from their biological families by the state and need substitute families who can look after them permanently. Family Futures is recognized as a center of excellence for its innovative and pioneering work with this group of children, and 98% of the children who come to Family Futures, despite the difficulties they bring, stay with the families that they're living with. And in the past 16 years, over 400 children and their families have been assessed and treated at Family Futures. Before I go on with the PowerPoint, I just wanted to say that, first of all, the PowerPoint and our own research, which we'll be referring to, can be downloaded from our website, and the last slide will have our website details on it. But I also wanted to set a context for our talk, very briefly. The children that we work with at Family Futures have been removed from their biological families because of maltreatment. They've been removed by the police, by social workers, and then they are fostered. The parents are taken to court, and a judge ultimately decides whether those children can go home, or whether they remain in permanent foster care, or are adopted. And in the UK, children can be adopted up until about the age of 8. We don't just do baby adoptions, we do older child adoptions. And as you know, adoption is the legal transfer of parental rights from the biological parent to the adoptive parent. So it's quite a profound legal judgment that the judge has to make. The other context I wanted to just briefly say is that We set up Family Futures 25 years ago. Well, no, sorry. We started working with this group of children 25 years ago, and we set up Family Futures 17, 18 years ago. And the reason we set up Family Futures was because we found that you can take a child out of a trauma situation, but it's not so easy to take the trauma out of the child. And we saw many families, foster families or adoptive families, who had taken on children who were 5 years, 6 years of age, 7 years of age, sometimes in sibling groups, and the children's behavior remained difficult. So adoptive parents began to become fixated on the fact that love is not enough. They needed more than love to help change their children. The sort of behaviors that the children continued to exhibit in their foster family or their adoptive family was poor attachments to the parents, a lack of trust in adults, poor eating, sleeping, and toileting patterns, poor emotional regulation, poor problem solving, or as we call it, executive functioning difficulties. Often they would continue to lie or steal, and they would be aggressive and violent towards their parents, their foster carers or their adoptive parents, or violent towards their teachers or to their peers, and sometimes to their siblings. So, to cut a long story short, we're going to present you now the thinking that's gone into how you can help children who have experienced violence in their family of origin. The term we are currently using, which is one you may be familiar with and is current in the USA and in the UK, is developmental trauma. Children who've witnessed any kind of abuse, and that includes obviously observing domestic violence, are now recognized by us as suffering from developmental trauma. Every aspect of that child's development is impacted and impaired by maltreatment. The common features of all maltreated children who are removed from their biological families are neglect, emotional and physical abuse, and sometimes sexual abuse, often sexual abuse as well, and they have been exposed to violence in the family. I call it the unholy trinity, because those three risk factors often go together. That we deal with possibly more extreme family situations than the more common, if you like, domestic violence. But often it's hard to see that there is domestic violence, violence from a partner to the mother of the child, without there being some degree of neglect by both parents for different reasons, and also physical abuse, emotional abuse, and sometimes, as I say, sexual abuse of the child. So it's naive to look at the impact of domestic violence on children in isolation. These toxic environments leave children with developing their senses, their sensory motor development, their emotions, and their cognitive development, having adapted to fear, and as one American psychologist says, terror. And I think we only have to think about ourselves as this big and seeing a man my size punch their mother to realize that is terror. It's not just stress or anxiety. I don't know how much of this you can read, but it's just a diagram to illustrate the fact that children growing up in a home where there is domestic violence, that's their roots, and this is the tree out of which they grow. And every aspect of their development, their physical development, their neurological development, is impacted by that traumatic early life experience. It's called the trauma tree. What we know is that pre-birth, there is now substantial research evidence from neuroscience to show that violence to pregnant women affects fetal development of the unborn child through the transmission to the womb of hormones such as cortisol. This leads to babies being born hyper-aroused and hyper-anxious, as those parts of the brain that are responsive to fear, such as the amygdala, have already been sensitized to violence in utero. There is also now evidence that there is epigenetic consequences for high levels of stress during pregnancy on fetal development and the child's subsequent development. So nurture, nature is more complex, as we now know, and certainly high levels of stress during pregnancy can trigger epigenetic consequences for the fetus. Post-birth, maternal preoccupation with the partner-related violence often leads to depression, possible alcohol and drug abuse, and mitigates against the formation of a secure attachment between that mother and their child. And this has an impact on the child's overall development and health outcomes. Psychologically, as children enter middle childhood, their response to aggression against their mothers is typically, in adopted children, one or all of these psychological defenses, which is to identify with the aggressor, to disassociate and cut off and shut down, to become prematurely self-reliant, and to develop low self-esteem as they feel they have failed to defend their mothers and therefore they feel worthless. And this is what we've heard from children talking to us. It's not what we're imagining. Jay is now going to talk about the model of intervention that we have developed.
Okay. I'm going to talk about something called neurophysiological psychotherapy, which is our treatment model, shortly known as NPP. And I think the most important thing to say about this, first of all, is that it's a neurosequential approach. And when one's thinking about trauma, and I know we're talking particularly about trauma to children, I think it's also important to be thinking about how trauma affects adults too. Because trauma isn't just in the head, it's not just what we remember, it's what happens to our whole nervous system, what happens to our whole body. So we're thinking about children who've been developmentally traumatized so that every aspect of their development has been impacted. And when one has to define a treatment model, one needs to be thinking not just about the memories of that trauma and how one can talk about it, but one has to think about how it affects our nervous system and our whole body. So our model is about thinking about mothers and the impact on violence on the child's development in utero and throughout the child's life. But it's also thinking about the development of the brain and the central nervous system and how the body becomes wired to trauma, so that the primitive brain, the reptilian brain's response to trauma, is to be triggered into a trauma response. The therapeutic intervention therefore needs to be thinking about developmentally the stages of the brain and the way the brain develops. Sorry, I'm having trouble reading the PowerPoint, this is easier. So it needs to be a systemic aspect approach that really looks at the child's capacity to heal and thinks about all aspects of their development. So part of our approach, as can be shown in this chart, is to think about all aspects of the child, so that we're not just thinking about therapy, that one needs to be thinking about the pediatrics, their physical health, because lots of children we see, their body has been impacted by the trauma, and they have particular health problems that are often being undetected. To think about their education services, how are they managing in education, and often if you've got trauma that you're trying to live with day to day, you're not managing at school, you're not managing to learn. And we know the prognosis for children who don't do well in school is much, much poorer. To think about their therapy needs, to think about what the child and the adult or all the people in the family need in therapy, to think about their sensory needs. We know lots of children whose sensory motor and their ability to take in information from the environment is impacted by trauma. So there's a real need to think about sensorially what they are taking in and how that information is being understood by them. To think about any psychiatric issues. We have lots of children who don't necessarily meet a psychiatric diagnosis, but actually if one thinks about developmental trauma as a psychiatric diagnosis, you know that they have profound difficulties, and sometimes they do need medication in order to really help their system calm and regulate because of the degree of violence and the difficulties that they're struggling with. To think about what support the parents need, what support the social work system can provide, so that there needs to be a whole team around the child thinking about all aspects, and a whole team around that family. As a result, we have a team at Family Futures of social workers, therapists, pediatric occupational therapists, education specialists, as well as consultants, psychiatric, pediatrician, psychologists, all of whom work together so that a bespoke package of therapy is designed for every child. Our treatment program works with all three levels of the brain, as I was saying, so that we're really thinking, first of all, about what's stored in the body. What does the body remember about the trauma? And then we're thinking about the feelings in the midbrain, the feelings that someone is left with after trauma. And I do think this really applies to adults as well as children. And then to finally think about the meaning, the higher brain, reflective thinking, the meaning and the sense one makes of that trauma. And so it's really important in any intervention with trauma to be thinking about all aspects of how someone processes and makes sense of their experiences. I think the good thing is there is hope, that we know that there's plasticity in the brain, that the brain and the nervous system can be helped to calm and to heal. But it takes time, and it does take a particular approach that isn't just working on one aspect of how someone is impacted. We know that children who've been in a violent family situation desperately need therapeutic help. And if we're going to stop the transmission of trauma from generation after generation, we have to think about how do you intervene with children? How do you help them not repeat that pattern, which is what we see happening when we look back through local authority files, that the history is repeated over and over again. We've now published our research, which will be referenced at the end of this, which has been really exciting to us. It's published in an international journal, and it's the first research of its size that actually looks at a way of really helping these children and these families heal. Now, I'm going to show you a little snippet of video before we end and go to lunch about a child called Maisie. The BBC in the UK came and filmed us for a year doing therapy with an adoptive family, or at that point it was a prospective adoptive family. And it tracked the course of the child through the therapy. Now this little girl, Maisie, who you see in the picture here, that's her adoptive dad and her adoptive mum, and that's little Maisie. She was 4 years living in a domestic violence situation with her sibling group of 4. She saw a lot of violence. She had a lot of violence inflicted on her. Tragically, the children would cling to their mother, to their birth mother, to try and stop her being beaten up by their father, and then as a result they would get hurt too, or sometimes when the mother wasn't there, the birth father would attack them as well. So she had 4 years of extreme violence, emotional abuse, neglect. She had a terrible time for 4 years. The local authority didn't intervene early enough to remove her and her siblings, so she had 4 years of terror. She then is placed in foster care. In foster care, she's extremely violent, so she keeps moving foster homes because no foster home can keep her because of her degree of violence. And the local authority are still looking for some brave adoptive family who are prepared to take her on. So they found that in Sue and Jim, who decided to take her on. The agreement they took her on was that she would get some therapy with us, and the agreement was as well that the BBC, not by us, the parents agreed that they would have the BBC come and film us. So we agreed to this. It was a bit stressful being filmed when you're doing therapy, but as a result we have some excellent video footage which I'm going to show you in the session later on today. But here what follows is an extract from the BBC film, and what it is it's a video where Maisie introduces herself. I don't know how it works in Spain, but in the UK there are sometimes little bits of video where children are, I suppose advertising themselves is the best way to put it. Children are saying who they are and what they're like, so that parents can look at them and decide if they would like to take them. So this is Maisie, age 7, but she gets adopted or placed for adoption when she's 8, talking about herself. Okay, I might need help here. Click the video. Here's Maisie.
Tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, 2 lovely eyes, and a little button of feet, my gentle.
7-year-old Maisie wants to be adopted.
I am a nice girl. I like to play with my toys.
But several families...
Sorry, we're having a few technical problems. It's all there. It was working yesterday.
Tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, 2 lovely. Tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, 2 lovely eyes, and a little button of feet, my gentle.
7-year-old Maisie wants to be adopted.
I am a nice girl. I like to play with my toys.
But several families have tried and given her back, and she doesn't believe she'll ever find a home.
I like to dance and I like to talk. I do, and be naughty, but not very much.
Her luck changed last year when she met an extraordinary couple who've already adopted 8 of the most damaged kids in care, and they decided to give her another chance.
For us, it wasn't about this pretty, attractive child who likes doing lots of things. It was about this hurt child that we thought we could help. And do you believe that we are going to adopt you? And that this is going to be your forever family that never sends you away? Yeah?
Okay, that's just a little clip. We'll be showing you more of that video later. And sorry for those who I haven't been speaking close enough to the mic to so you could hear me. We've got maybe a few minutes for questions before we break for lunch. Oh, might need headphones on. Come and stand here. Come and stand because you can hear. No. Okay.
No mic, no question. Okay.
Do you stand near the mic? Somebody asked something, I thought. Good question.
Thank you for your moving presentation. Do you think that the type of therapy that you've developed would be useful with adults as well, with women who have been the subject of violence themselves?
Yes, I mean, I think there is a lot of recent therapeutic work that has been done with, I don't need this, adults who've been traumatized. And a lot of what we do is what you would do with adults. Also, for children who remain with their mothers, for example, because the perpetrator is in prison or estranged and taken away from the family home, this model works with that group of parents as well, mother and child. Yeah. I just want to say, I think 3 key messages are important. One is that the impact of trauma, violence on mothers has a transgenerational effect. That it's not just a psychological impact, but it's a neurophysiological impact on the child's brain development and the development of the emotions and the central nervous system. And also, as Jay said, children can recover, but they do need therapeutic help with their parent, their mothers who they're living with. They both need help to recover from the trauma and the violence if the mother-child relationship is going to be repaired. And we'll be looking at that this afternoon. Thank you very much. There's one question over there, if you can.
Hola, buenos días. Muchas gracias por lo que nos está.
Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank you for all this information you have given us. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And I'm particularly interested when you were talking about bundled therapy or packages of therapy that should have 3 different areas, or 5, I can't remember. Feelings for the trauma, the cognitive interpretation of the different situations, the footprint that leaves, or the traces that leaves on the body that would then be transferred for generations if we don't stop it. And I wanted to ask you, how do you work with that in particular, practically?
Well, you're right. I mean, we work with what we call, as a simple model, the triune brain. There are 3 areas of the brain that are important to us: the primitive brain, the midbrain, which is the affective, the feelings brain, and the cortex and the frontal lobes, which is the thinking brain. And our therapeutic interventions are targeted at each of those different areas of the brain. And we'll be trying to demonstrate that this afternoon. But I think what's important from our point of view is that therapy has moved from a psychology of the mind to a neurobiological model of therapeutic intervention. Thank you for your question. I think people want to go to lunch, and we should let them. Muchas gracias.
I want to check.
Yeah.